Commissioner, or Uncle Wayne, thanks for joining me here on Victorian Aboriginal News today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Uncle, Yoorrook has three stated goals, three very clear goals, and they are: one, to establish historical truth, assist all Victorians, and that stress is on all Victorians understand that truth, and thirdly, assist in the transformation of Victoria to ensure past and current injustices don't continue. Now, it's in that third goal, in the transformation of Victoria, there's an obvious connection with the goals of treaty or treaties, especially for the traditional owner groups. So how is Yoorrook planning to collaborate or support traditional owner groups across the state as they work towards treaties with the state government?
Well, the first part of that question is about our very existence, and that is we need to go back to the Treaty Assembly. And I think it was in June 2020 they then made that really strong upfront statement. That is, without truth, there can't be no treaty.
And this is when they called for the formation of the Justice Commission.
That is then saw the establishment of the Yoorrook Justice Commission. So that's our relationship with the Treaty Assembly and the treaty process. However, we do have an independent sort of relationship or an independent status because we are a Royal Commission mandated by the Victorian government and also through the letters patent.
Yes.
And that gives us our independence. However, we have this close interrelationship with the Treaty Assembly and the treaty process because at the end of our work, after we do our inquiry and then use the information from the inquiry to make our recommendations, they will go in to the treaty process. So that will complement the treaty process. That will be the mechanism that will allow us to deliver our recommendations.
So that final report, which is due in 2024, do you envisage that's going to be used extensively by traditional owner groups to support them as they work towards treaty, to provide some justification to the state government?
Yes, exactly. That will culminate. All of the evidence that we collect, and including the stories from the elders, traditional owners and the community, will all culminate then in the final recommendations.
And once again it goes back to we can't have treaty without truth.
That is the fundamental,
of course,
statement. Yep.
Uncle Wayne, in the second goal, we've discussed the third, and that second goal, which is to help all Victorians understand the truth, the Commission has actually stated that to achieve this, there's also the need to learn how culture has evolved. And certainly since invasion, there's been an enormous evolution of culture, especially within Victoria. And it's quite evident when we look at what we call, or commonly call, or refer to as urban Aboriginality, which is essentially a hybrid model of culture coming in from all over, not just Victoria, but the country. So what are some of the key challenges that you and your fellow commissioners and the staff at Yoorrook see that you might face in learning about that evolution of culture?
Yes, well, culture is a very dynamic concept, evolving concept, and of course we look at culture as something that continues, the continuity of culture, adapting to many changing circumstances and continuing into the present day. So I'm sitting here now talking to you, and of course I don't fit the stereotype of Aboriginal culture that many people out there would have. That is, I'm not sitting here in a lap with a spear in my hand. I'm living in the present day context, but within me, my identity, particularly as a Yorta Jadjarong elder, is steeped, is grounded in that Aboriginal culture, identity and connections with country. So that's our approach, is to look at that in the full context, what we call a holistic approach.
Right.
To looking at Aboriginal culture, sourcing it back into the traditional aspect, traditional timeline, and then coming forward and looking how culture has evolved over a period of time, adapted to many changing circumstances and many quite catastrophic circumstances when you look at the impact of colonisation, of course, and then the continuity that has come through now in terms of the vibrant community and population of over 47,000 people.
Right.
In Victoria today, who have very strong connections and identity.
Just following through on what you said then, Uncle, is that in understanding this new or evolving culture that we all experience here, especially in Melbourne and the major areas, do you think that there's an opportunity here for Yoorrook and the findings that Yoorrook eventually has to assist people who haven't really identified as Aboriginal people because they're almost ashamed of the fact that they're pale skinned, they may be blue-eyed, they may have fair hair, but they are indeed Aboriginal people? So can you see that there will be benefit from the findings for a lot of these people?
Yeah, well, I think that's something that will come out strong, because keeping in mind, we use the term that culture is not a frozen in time and place concept, talking about evolution of culture. So yes, we hope that this will bring that out. It will bring that out in those who have been probably less fortunate in terms of to have that grounding in their cultural background and their identity from where they come from. That's a lovely sounding singing song for me. Thank you very much.
We'll definitely leave that in there, don't worry about that. Uncle Wayne, one of the methods that Yoorrook intends to undertake its work is to seek information from the state government and other institutions or organisations. I think it actually states institutions, which is much more appropriate. And this is information about current and past injustices or practices and policies. So as someone who's spent decades, almost their entire life, searching for the truth and fighting for the truth and seeking information and evidence, do you see that there are potential problems in obtaining that truth from the government and other institutions?
A very timely question, I must say. And that's exactly what we've been talking about just in the last few days. And that is how we go about researching and collecting information from what we call government and non-government entities. And as we know, there's a huge database tucked away there in all of those different government bodies, institutions, that we need to get access to. And of course, this is where one of our commissioners comes to the forefront, very well versed, experienced in the whole concept of data sovereignty. So we have this principle of data sovereignty that we're using in terms of accessing, extracting information from government, non-government entities, other sources, and then having a sense of control over that information, over that database at the end of the process, including acknowledging the ownership rights of the knowledge keepers, that we call. We look at this in terms of knowledge keepers. Then we're the knowledge seekers. So this is the sort of relationship that exists between us seeking the knowledge from those who keep the knowledge in the community. So their ownership of that knowledge is tantamount, is uppermost in our approach in terms of how we go about accessing the huge amount of information that we need to collect in regards to our inquiry and then ultimately the recommendations that we do produce.
Do you see problems though in obtaining required data from the government and institutions? Because after all, it's difficult to know what you're looking for if you don't necessarily know what these institutions and the government departments have. So there's got to be some degree of uncertainty or challenge there at least.
Well, there's certainly a challenge there, but what assists us in that process is we are a Royal Commission. We are like other Royal Commissions. We are mandated with powers to request that information and get access to that information, and even request that information is provided. So that is quite unique in terms of this Yoorrook Justice Commission being the first of its kind in Australia, and particularly in Victoria, empowered with those powers as a Royal Commission in terms of accessing and collecting information from government and non-government entities.
Uncle Wayne, one of the Yoorrook values is welcoming of everyone to contribute information and to join Yoorrook in that path to justice and truth. Now that includes Victorian traditional owners, non-Victorian Aboriginal people, and of course non-Indigenous people. It seems to me that this does have the potential to open up the floodgates for conflicting truths. There may be some non-Aboriginal people who don't want to share the truth of what's gone on in their families beforehand, and I'm sure you've come across that over the years. So what strategies will the Commission have in place to determine just what is the truth amongst these conflicting truths that will emerge?
Well, indeed, what is truth? I mean, if we can go back to a French philosopher, I think he had mentioned something about truth. There's no such thing as truth. There are different versions of truth.
Right.
But at the end of the day, if there's enough voices touching on the same issues, if there is a pattern of systemic injustice resulting from the impact of colonisation and the other things in terms that impacted on First Peoples, policies, practices and so forth, well then it gives more strength to the version of truth that is coming through. So in answer to the first part of the question, it is absolutely imperative that we have an open, what we call an opening, welcoming approach to that. We have an open door policy. We don't draw any distinctions between whose voices we are listening to. You know, we have to listen to all the voices. We have to listen to the elders. We have to listen to the young people, and we have to listen to people from all walks of life or whatever political persuasions they may have. So, you know, that's, I suppose, drawing on the sort of cultural principles that applied like at the outset, and particularly in regards to colonisation. I think, you know, when you look at the history, our people were very welcoming.
Yeah,
were
for
very
sure.
welcoming people until they realised, you know, welcoming is fine, but there has to be a reciprocal sort of arrangement to that. It's a two-way process, but but it is absolutely imperative, you know, that we do have this open, broad, welcoming approach to it, and listen to all voices, and that includes Indigenous voices, non-Indigenous voices, because that's the body of evidence then that we have
For sure.
at the end of the process to draw on, and upon which we can then make our recommendations.
Uncle Wayne, in reviewing the Commission's internal cultural protocols, which I know are very important to the operations now and going forward with Yoorrook, I've noticed that the Commissioners are required to competently work within an Aboriginal paradigm. Can you clarify just what specifically constitutes an Aboriginal paradigm and sets it apart from one in which a non-Aboriginal commission might work?
Well, I think that reflects the nature and composure of the commission itself. Right? So we have 4 Aboriginal people from Victoria, 1 from Tasmania, and we have one non-Aboriginal person who's a very experienced person in the body of law that we're drawing upon.
Yep.
So I think that explains the paradigm. That is the paradigm. And of course, within that paradigm, we are exercising that authority that we have as a commission, largely represented by Indigenous voices, to ensure that reflects itself. The cultural imperative is so important for this whole process. We know that it's a royal commission, right? So there's a lot of comparative examples of royal commissions, but this is unique. It's a first of its kind, and it is grounded in a cultural background in terms of how it is represented through the Aboriginal voices, but also through the non-Aboriginal person who is part of that. And that is really interesting dynamic in terms of how that is working. And of course, Kevin Bell, who was a senior law man, senior justice of the Supreme Court, and he's a very knowledgeable person in human rights. But he is also very knowledgeable in First Peoples culture, history and law, and that he's worked within that framework on native title issues and the criminal justice system and all of those different areas of law that he brings to us.
Well, you're surprised, just talking about the makeup of the commission itself, because I do know that in the community a lot of us were thinking, well, if we get 3 Aboriginal commissioners out of the 5, we're really going to be looking good. Was it a surprise for you and some of the other commissioners that we ended up with 80% of the commissioners being Aboriginal?
I would say yes, indeed. A surprise that we are a majority, and surprised also, I would say, a great acknowledgement, of course, into how that was recognised in setting up the commission by ensuring that it was fully represented by Aboriginal voices to that extent. So, that is working very well. And myself, I think, wow, this is a great opportunity we have to make it really work in terms of representing the whole state, in terms of First Peoples, culture, history.
And of course law, but L-O-R-E and L-A-W.
Law and L-O-R-E.
Yeah.
Yes, looking at both sides of the law in terms of the oldest and original law, of course, has been superseded by the imported common law. But, there has to be a sort of coexistence there in terms of the application of the law and the recognition of the traditional customary law that underpins that.
Uncle Wayne Atkinson, Commissioner Wayne Atkinson, thank you so much for joining me on Victorian Aboriginal News.
And thank you very much. A pleasure.